What's going on, Packers fans? Aaron Nagler here, Cheesehead TV, joined by a very special guest in one, Paul Bretl, the Packers beat writer for ESPN LaCrosse. Paul, how are you today?
Excellent, Aaron. Happy to be here.
Wanted to touch base with you after the Combine because I know lots of folks like yourself make sure to track all the ins and outs when it comes to the athletic testing, the results therein. So I don't have to, essentially. You know, as chief vibe master here at Cheesehead TV, I leave that work to professionals like yourself. And I know you wrote about this for ESPN LaCrosse as far as Packers prospects and post-combine who maybe set themselves apart and or kind of made it obvious these might be guys who the Packers might be interested in this upcoming draft.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what I did was I went through the big positions in need that we know the Packers have and took a look at kind of the past history with Brian Gutekunst in terms of what are some specific on-field tests that the athletes go through at their respective position groups that the Packers seem to really hone in on. And then I also took a look at what their overall relative athletic score was, because again, there's a connection between Packers draft picks and how they perform on that scale. Now, I'm just going to give my disclaimer here. The relative athletic score, the RAS, everything that we're talking about today,
Sure.
This is one tool in the evaluation tool belt. And in no way do I think that Brian Gutekunst is scrolling X Twitter right now looking up RAS cards, okay?
That'd be brilliant if he was, though, I will say.
Right.
It's an amazing image.
But from the outside perspective, where we are obviously not privy to what's going on behind the scenes, there is a connection between how these players perform relative to that scale in certain on-field tests, that there's patterns, there's trends that have developed over time. So in terms of, from our perspective, trying to get any sort of insight, peek behind the curtain, any sort of edge that we can, and trying to identify who might the Green Bay Packers be interested in, I do think that there is value in at least being mindful of who these players are that hit these marks.
I think it's a big thing in this day and age where everybody's a draftnik, right? Everybody wants to, quote, do their own research when it comes to who the Packers might take, right? Mm-hmm. And to your point, I think it's a phenomenal guidepost to kind of draw names out of a whole mass of prospects where if you are out there wanting to do your own research and look up certain guys, this is a great way to hone down that list, so to speak. And, you know, Paul, a lot of times I hear folks, you got to eat your vegetables first. You know, we're not doing that here. We're going with the dessert. We're going to lead with wide receiver because that's fun. And I know Packers fans are real drilled into the idea of the Packers adding talent at that position this offseason, either through free agency or the draft. But draft specifically, coming off of the combine, who maybe opened your eyes as far as, oh, yeah, these guys will definitely be on the Packers' radar?
Absolutely. So the metrics that I use, 6 out of Gutekunst's 9 receiver draft picks have scored a RAS of 8.4 or higher. So that was my line in the sand. And then we know that they prefer the bigger bodied wide receivers to help out in the run game. So I used 5'11", 185, 190 pounds as kind of the benchmark for that. And then the 3-cone drill has kind of been another differentiator in terms of who the Packers have selected. So registering a time of under 7.1 seconds in that drill. And the receiver group of the positions that I went through was easily the longest list. I think I had maybe 12 or 15 prospects listed.
You have a bunch. Let's just go through like the first 4 or 5.
Yeah, absolutely.
I do think, to your point, there are a ton, which I actually found somewhat surprising because the talking point heading into this draft has been how it's not a receiver-rich class. And I think maybe that's true at the top, right?
Yep.
But I do think there are a boatload of prospects coming off the combine where I think, yeah, they've probably, are in the Packers' crosshairs.
Yeah, absolutely. Isaiah Nair from Nebraska, Sam Brown from Miami, Jaden Higgins from Iowa State, Isaiah Tesla from Arkansas. Those were the 4 at the top of the list in terms of combine performance. And how I think this could impact what the Packers do. Like you said, there's a lot of, I think generally with this draft, once you get into rounds 2 and 3, I think the depth in that regard is really valuable. But I do wonder how there being a lack of maybe that high-end superstar talent that we've grown accustomed to,
some of these guys up, right,
impacts how the Packers approach the receiver position, because if they're going to add, they need a true number 1. Going out and getting another guy who's a number 2, a number 3, like that just adds to kind of the log jam, so to speak, that they already have in this wide receiver room. So I just wonder in terms of that regard, because we don't know if there's that necessary superstar high-end talent. Does adding another number 2, number 3 type receiver to this room really accomplish what this Packers offense needs? Now, I will say, skill set wise, what they definitely need to add is a vertical presence while Christian Watson's out, because if that element's not there, moving the ball in general, run game, passing game, becomes a lot more difficult.
I think the one guy who stands out here is Higgins. I know it's funny because going into the draft, I know Tyler Brook on the Draft Industrial Complex, he had been kind of zeroed in on him already as far as if you need a Packers type out of this group, he's your guy. I mean, big guy, and he did test very well. And I don't think he, did himself any disservice during his time in Indy. I think as far as the testing goes, that's the one to me. If you get to day 2 and the Packers pull the trigger on a receiver, I think he stands out as the most likely. Now, issue for the Packers is, this is true in the first round and pretty much every round, is at the moment, I mean, who knows what happens on draft day with trades, et cetera, but at the moment, there's almost a murderer's row of teams that are also in the market for wide receivers, drafting literally right in front of the Packers, whether it's the Chargers, the Broncos, there's one or two more there, the Steelers, there's a litany of teams that are also going to be looking for receiver help. I don't think that helps the Packers in this draft.
Yeah, one of the talking points from a year ago now when Brian Gutekunst was speaking with us that still sticks out to me is from that 2023 season, how important competition was to just the growth, not just the receiver room, but this roster as a whole. And it really felt like from that 2023 season, that was something that he took from that experience and said, I need to replicate this each offseason as often as I can. So to contradict myself from what I said earlier, that it was another reason why adding to this receiver room is very much in play, because you're coming off of a season where a lot of these guys did not take the step forward that you were hoping they were going to in 2024. So bring in some competition to add more fuel to what hopefully becomes a step forward.
Yeah, to your point, Brian was asked about that point blank in our session with him in Indy regarding the drops, right? And because the Packers, depending on who's doing the counting, they were, top of the league or in the top 3 as far as drop passes by wide receivers. And I think it was Tom Silverstein who asked directly, is one way to improve there just adding competition to the room? And Brian said, absolutely. I mean, that I think would be the idea here. It's not a question of, okay, we have to add a certain type. I think it's much more about, look, we got to continue to push these guys. And look, sooner rather than later, it's contract decision time, injuries strike. We're already dealing with that with Christian Watson, obviously. So I think, if there's upside in a guy, to your point, that fits their parameters, where this guy tests and checks all the boxes, man, I would not be surprised to see them pull the trigger on a receiver on day 2 in particular. No question about it. Let's take a look at defensive line in general, both tackle and end. I do think it's funny. Shamar Stewart is a guy who's been earmarked to the Packers for a while now, prior to the combine. I think his testing takes him out of consideration there at 23. I'll be shocked if he makes it that far down the line. But to your kind of overall purview here, who are some guys at both end and tackle who maybe did themselves some favors as far as potentially landing in Green Bay?
Yeah, as far as the defensive end position goes, Gutekunst takes the elite of the elite when it comes to athleticism. 4 of his 5 draft picks have scored 8.97 out of 10 or higher on that RAS scale. And we know at defensive end in particular, Gutekunst prefers those bigger bodied edge defenders to hold up against the run. Now, personally, I think there could be value in adding a different flavor, a different skill set with some speed. But nonetheless, in terms of what the Packers do, those bigger bodied edge rushers, so 250, 255 pounds is kind of been the baseline minimum for what they typically look for at that position. So I used a RAS of 8 or 9.0 or higher, and then also looked at the explosive drills, the vertical, the broad jump, how well their 10-yard split was in the 40 compared to others within those position groups, because those are other important elements for the defensive end positions. Like you mentioned, Shamar Stewart from A&M, Landon Jackson from Arkansas, Tyler Barron from Miami, and then Barron Sorrell from Texas are some defensive end names to know. When it comes to defensive tackle, as far as RAS goes, this one out of all the positions on this roster there really isn't it's a large variance in terms of what the RAS is. Only 3 of Gutekunst's 8 picks have scored 8.0 or higher. And I attribute that to just kind of the wide ranging body types and builds that you can have from an interior defensive lineman. But this one's been tougher RAS wise to get a beat on in terms of what the Packers are going to do. But nonetheless, 8.0 is generally the mark. So that's what I use. And again, those explosive drills, vertical jump, broad jump, 10-yard split. And then for size, I use 290 pounds as the baseline. I remember a couple of years ago when I think it was Green Bay when they drafted Kobe Wooden, who I think was in the 270, 280 range. Right. And that was very much an outlier selection in that regard. So again, 8.0 or higher, explosive drills, 290 pounds or larger. And some names to know there: Warren Brinson from Georgia, Darius Alexander from Toledo, TJ Sanders from South Carolina.
Yeah, I don't doubt for a moment that this is a position where they add, and maybe not even necessarily guys who might be on this list, because there are some guys who didn't test, right? And you never really know how the Packers are looking at it, what their line of demarcation might be. But I do think there's little doubt in my mind that defensive tackle is an area where they will be adding one, if not two, prospects from this draft class. It's too deep and it's too talented. And looking ahead, that seems to be a position where they're going to have need both this year and next.
Yeah, there's a line from Gutekunst at the combine this week where it was just to the point where, hey, if we're going to accomplish our goals this season, our pass rush has to get more consistent. I mean, you can tell. And throughout Gutekunst's tenure, at least for me, usually it's the hindsight, right? It's reflecting on it where you go, oh, he told us, or he hinted at what's front of mind, what's being prioritized. So trying to be more mindful of that. To me, that's one of those, that's a radar going off right there that's saying, hey, if we're going to do what we got to do, this has to get better. And of course, hopefully that comes from some internal improvement, but very much feels like, again, as you mentioned, the depth of this class, just taking advantage of the talent that's there, that these are going to be positions they add to.
I mean, it's kind of what he did a couple years ago with receiver, right? That was a receiver-rich class when he took Watson and Dobbs, and that's not necessarily like a harbinger of things to come. But, you look at this year, receivers nowhere near as deep and rich talent-wise as that class was. So I think there's some credence to what you're talking about as far as take advantage of the depth in this class at that position, especially since it lines up with your need this year and going forward. Speaking of needs, Packers definitely going to be needing to add talent to the cornerback room. Now, I know there's a bit of a kind of a wide swath of opinion here when it comes to the Packers have to add frontline starters versus no, they need bodies, they need depth, etc. I tend to think the latter is probably more likely, but given what we saw in Indy, who do you think is going to be on the Packers' radar come draft time?
Yeah, so at the cornerback position, again, another position where elite athleticism obviously prioritized. 5 of Gutekunst's 7 cornerback draft picks scored 9.0 or higher on the RAS scale. Size and length a priority at this position for Gutekunst, 5'11", 185, 190 pounds, being kind of line in the sand. Although I wish I could remember where I saw this. I apologize, but I saw a quote from Gutekunst talking about the cornerback position and how they might look more towards vision awareness in terms of the evaluation process, because that's what is really important to the Jeff Hafley defense. I did think that was an important nugget from the combine, but again, size, length, still a priority, RAS of 9.0 or higher. And then a 3-cone, that change of direction ability of 6.9 seconds or better. So a couple standouts in that regard. Darian Porter from Iowa State, super, super talented athlete. Also a very raw player. I think he has only around 1,000 career college snaps. So does fit that Packers mold. Max Hairston from Kentucky, and then Jahdae Barron from Texas.
Yeah, Barron had a really good week. He was a talk of the town. Well, once he stepped on the field and did his testing, it was you couldn't stop hearing about him. I do think there's a decent chance that they look his way if he's available when they're on the clock. And then switching over to the offensive side of the ball, clearly we come off that playoff game where one injury really kind of wrecked them up front. You got to think they're going to continue to look to add. I mean, I think outside of all but one season so far with Gutekunst as general manager, they've taken an offensive lineman, at least one, in every single draft, except that one particular one where they didn't. I got to think this is an area they look specifically on day 2, but maybe even on day 1 to add. Who, in your mind, stood out and maybe put themselves on the Packers' radar?
Yeah, to your point, 3 of the last 4 drafts, Goody's taken 3 offensive linemen. So he doesn't just address it; he addresses the need heavily. And we saw the depth right on display against the Eagles. And the Eagles are going to make a lot of starting offensive lines look
a lot of
silly.
people look bad. No
So we got
doubt.
to take that with a grain of salt. But Josh Myers, a free agent this offseason, Zach Tom, Sean Ryan, Rasheed Walker, all free agents just a year from now. So the recipe's there for Goody to add to it. And when it comes to the offensive line, athleticism wise, 8 of his 11 draft picks scored 8.0 or higher on the RAS scale. So again, that was our floor. The 3-cone, the shuttle, the agility drills are really important to the Packers in this evaluation, but hardly any of the offensive linemen participated in those drills at the combine. So of the position groups we're going through, this one's probably the most uncertain in terms of the specific conversation that we're having right now.
Which is funny because I can't help but recall how he took Josh Myers without any kind of baseline testing available. I mean, at least like outside, we were left kind of in the dark. I know there was hardly anything available when they took Myers, which to this day I know rankles a whole lot of folks given the Creed Humphrey ascension in Kansas City.
Yeah, so for this exercise, we just used a RAS of 8.0 or higher. And then also the other disclaimer, we know the Packers will draft day 3 offensive tackles and move them into guards. So for this exercise, I didn't take that variable into consideration. But some names to know at offensive tackle: Jalen Travis from Iowa State, Logan Brown from Kansas. In terms of the interior offensive line, and I highlighted these 2 specifically because we know that the Green Bay Packers love Georgia Bulldogs: Tate Ratledge, their guard; Jared Wilson, their center.
Yeah, and I think, like we were just talking about, with Myers set to become a free agent, I think not just interior, but center in particular is going to be a position where they look to add. They may feel like they have the guy on hand already as far as who's up next, but the last 2 centers they've drafted with the particular idea of this is our new center, they've both started week 1, and Corey Linsley and Josh Myers. Now, it took an injury for Linsley to get on the field that week 1, but point remains, like both times these kids have come in as rookies and started right away. So that remains a possibility here out of this class. I don't think there's any question that they'll continue to foster the competition. And these guys that you're pointing out will certainly be on the radar in that regard. Paul, cannot thank you enough for the time, man. I always appreciate your work and your coverage of the Packers. Make sure you check out Paul's work. There'll be a link in the description of this video for you to check it out. Paul, thanks so much, man.
Thanks, Aaron. Appreciate it.